like to start the work session. We go around the table, identify, starting with Mr. Birch.
Chris Birch, Assembly.
L.D. Gray Jackson.
Big Training Assembly.
Tim Steele, 708.
Amy Kowalski.
Jennifer Johnston.
Adam Trombley.
Bill Starr.
Paul Holman, Assembly.
Patrick.
Patrick Fletcher.
Awesome. So, Mr. Abbott, are you presenting?
I'm ready whenever you guys are, Mr. Chairman.
You are ready to go. We're ready to go. Everyone's ready to go.
Mr. Chairman, for the record, my name is Mike Abbott. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the school district, and I'm here today to discuss Assembly Resolution 2013-117, which is item 11B on next Tuesday's Assembly agenda, regular meeting agenda. Assemblyman Johnston introduced this resolution at our request. The goal of this is not to change any existing practice. In fact, it is to cement the practice that has been taking place, we believe, essentially since 2007, when the Assembly changed code related to school site selection and the Assembly's review of certain choices that the school district made during capital projects deliberations. Since then, we've been asked by the state to clarify what this means. There's a state code requirement. Well, just to provide some context. The state statutes require that school district projects go through either a municipal or borough assembly review, or that responsibility be delegated to the school board. The statute provides two options, and the delegation can be in total or in part. But the default option is that there be a review of the design and the selection of the designer of record, the architect or engineer, that those two decisions would be endorsed by the municipal assembly. And we've attached a copy of the statute section and highlighted in yellow the section E, subsection E, that describes those responsibilities that the school board is responsible for and those that the assembly must review. And then in subsection I, we've highlighted the section that allows for the delegation of that responsibility. In the year 2000, the assembly passed a resolution that essentially delegated to the school board the responsibility for repairs. And it's a little bit unclear as to the exact definition of what repairs constitute. That resolution is attached as well, and that resolution is still in effect. So it's pretty clear that the assembly intended in 2000 for the school board to be responsible for the maintenance of the school buildings. And the school district's been doing a lot of that since 2000 and well before that as well. What appears to be less clear is whether this resolution also delegates to the board the responsibility for large projects, major renewals of school buildings, new construction, replacement of school buildings, etc. It's not very clear that this resolution from 2000 actually accomplishes that. So in 2007, up until 2007, there was municipal code that required the school board to bring school design and selection of designers to the assembly. And that process was followed for many, many years. In 2007, and Assemblyman Johnston and Assemblyman Clayman, I think at the time, sponsored a code change that was adopted unanimously that changed that process. And it also changed the process related to school site selections, which I think was the larger issue at the time, George. That was the issue we were more concerned about at the time. I think the general sense was that it was okay to delete the code sections requiring assembly review of the selection of the designer and assembly review of school designs, because the history had been that the assembly was not was comfortable with the school board making those choices. That the detailed assessment of school designs, that the detailed processes that the district used to select its designers was generally acceptable. The hearings that were held on during those assembly reviews never generated any public interest. We went back and looked at a bunch of them. The only public comment that anybody could find that took place during those assembly reviews was Paul D. Kendall talking about hydrogen. Not to say that that wasn't germane to the topic, but and I'm not suggesting that there wasn't value to that, but there was no recent examples, like over the last 15 years, where the public had taken advantage of the assembly review opportunity to provide guidance to the assembly that might have affected the assembly's review. The school board still has several public hearings associated with the approval of school designs and the approval of school designers. So there will remain robust public comment opportunities. Similarly, the district will still have the responsibility for all of the, what I would call regulatory reviews of school designs. Planning and Zoning, Urban Design Commission, ZEBA, Planning and the Planning Board all have roles, and depending on the school project, all have active roles in reviewing these types of projects. We'll be before ZEBA in the next month or so talking about a height variance for the Girdwood School. We'll be before the Planning and Zoning Commission to talk about, well, Girdwood as well, but also improvements at South High. We're before the Urban Design Commission talking about the landscaping requirements for several projects over the next 6 months. So that process continues and is not affected by this resolution, and we're not suggesting that it should be. All we're trying to accomplish with AR 13-117 is to clearly describe to the state that the state statutory requirement for delegation of this responsibility to the school board has been met. And that concludes my prepared presentation, Mr. Chairman. I'm certainly available to answer questions.
So I guess it's somebody else that maybe, we don't have legal here, but
I think we have legal here.
somebody familiar with it is what I mean.
Take it a home. Bill, what are you trying to make a reference to?
In the duties and responsibilities for the Planning and Zoning Commission, aren't they specified to be advisory to the mayor and to the assembly?
Advisory in what sense?
Well, that's what I'm asking is that, when you read code, it talks about the duties and responsibilities. You're going to know more of this.
Well, they act in both capacities. Sometimes their decisions advisory and sometimes they're
Correct.
regulatory.
But isn't it specific right now to those two bodies, the assembly and the mayor's office? And I don't think they're specific to support. Are they advisory to the school board too?
Well, it's on site selection. There's a joint meeting, the school board, the planning commission does, that's a decision. That board is on the assembly for action. When they look at the major site plan review of the future major site.
Well, I know in actual practice, I would just really specify the language that allows them to be direct support to the school board.
So the difference here is he's talking about the design of the structure, whereas the regulatory bodies, planning and zoning and the urban design are talking about site selection or site plan, not necessarily the design of the structure itself.
Well, what's the appeal process under the, and the reason I bring that up is that who's the appeal process if you have a dispute? You get two contractors that dispute the award either through Chapter 7 or whatever. Where would it ultimately be decided by the assembly to mediate would it then be deferred, such as a resolved action? Would that be a school district scenario then only?
Well, we have to look at what the plan is under this proposal. My recollection is the old memorandum in '82 may have spoken to the use of the purchasing code. I don't know what you guys are using for design professionals right now, but presuming it was following our purchasing code, it would follow that appeal process.
Because therein lies the point, and it was a facetious statement earlier, but with when we delegate all that over there and there's a legal matter or dispute, we lose you, I would think, in your office and the ability to get in the game. Whereas the assembly action goes south, or we have a problem later on, and the municipality is sued, then we have you engaged from it. So I guess the delegation of that is one of the concerns I have, is if we delegate the full authority and we get into trouble later, what do you see happening?
What are you guys using for your, I think you're using JDO for your.
Right, our counsel's provided through outside counsel, and they're the ones that guide us if there's a procurement-related challenge,
yeah.
right, lawsuit or appeal, which there are from time to time. Our procurement code is essentially similar. There's some procedural differences, but it follows the same basic tenets as required by state and municipal code. All of those decisions, though, are made inside the district. So the appeal process for an unhappy proposer on a school design project would go through an appeal process inside the school district. And that ultimately would be adjudicated by the board at the, that's the final appeal level.
Adjudicating meaning mediated?
Potentially, but they would make the final decision. There would be a superior court remedy available as well, but just like there would be for the
So
municipality.
I don't want to debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing here. I have just one more question. When, in more theory here, where, for example, we have the west side, or West High campus design or a long-term master plan in that, do you feel that then it pushes the review of that plan? Because I would assume we would still retain that in the assembly authority of a master plan design, or would that go to?
That's not current. That does not currently exist, and nothing in this resolution would give that. Would move that to the assembly.
Well, I guess that's my point in that, is what then level do we have to put, our input from a community feedback perspective into, say, the West High master plan? If you have the authority to approve that plan and then now the authority to build it without coming through us, do we go into a place that doesn't provide all the public process?
The primary tool that the assembly would retain is the same one you have on most school district behavior, which is the power of purse. You would control the funding stream for any capital projects, as you currently do for operating projects and capital projects now. So that's the primary tool.
Voters do in our bond approval, that's the only.
And they do, and you all have to approve the bonds before they can go on the ballot.
Okay.
So just like, whether it's something related to our operating program, you guys have essentially delegated that decision-making to the school board within an upper limit that you've set. You similarly have control, you have actually more control over our capital program because of your ability to write our bond ordinances, that we have to stay within that authority. But the detail of what project, is built and where, it has currently been delegated to the district, and we're suggesting would continue to be delegated to the district.
Thanks for the answer.
Mr. Honeman and Mr. Trainee. Go ahead, Mr. Steele.
I guess if we've been doing it for many decades, I'm realizing now, of course, that it's more specifically spelled out in this resolution.
Right.
If we say no and we decide we don't want to continue the same practice, who would it go back to? Would it go to Mr. Weaver? Who would then be responsible for, I guess, the meat and potatoes, the elbow turning, the
The
grease?
same people that are responsible for it now. Nothing in the procedure is changing.
You could just state your name for the record.
Jerry Weaver, Director of Community Development. The procedures, like Mr. Abbott said, are going to stay in effect just as they are today. Although we have some nuances in the new code that are going to change it a little bit, but primarily still the Planning and Zoning Commission authority and the Urban Design Commission authority for site plans of the project. So the Assembly isn't seeing those now, other than the site selection decision.
So do you see a problem with this specific, Mr. Goodman?
Well, the issue here is not the site plan, site selection, it's the design.
Right.
Design professionals. So those in the absence of a different arrangement, the question is whether those should come to the assembly for approval or be wholly within the purview of the school board. So that's what you're trying to answer here.
Correct.
So the assembly has the authority to pull that responsibility back to itself.
So we could redo another resolution to change our.
To say,
course
we
if
want to
have
look at
major
designs and we want to look at designer selections.
Okay.
That, I think those are the basic, and there might be some middle ground in there too, but essentially, those are the options that state statute provides.
Mr. Horniman, just the reason for this table that I handed out, if you have a copy, is to show you that there has been an ebb and flow to this, as Mr. Abbott indicated. Sometimes the assembly's retained it, sometimes it's given to the school board, sometimes it's taken back, so it can be changed and has been changed in the past.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Trainee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Abbott, has the school district looked at 13? Have they ruled on it yet? The school board, have they viewed this yet?
No, they will, if the assembly endorses the approach that this resolution has, then the school board would act on it, would have the opportunity to act on it as well. And they're aware, obviously, that this is being brought forward, and they've stated their preference that the status quo be continued.
Status quo?
Right.
Thank you. Just a question for Mr. McGrath. Tom, it's good to see you this morning. Have any comments on this? I mean, you're here, so you usually see you this early in the morning.
Sure.
I'm used to Sunday meetings. Do you have any comments on this?
Just state your name.
My name's Tom McGrath, and the largest amount of monies the city spends at any one time is generally on its schools. And there's people like myself that really keeps track of what the assembly does, but there's only so many hours in the day, so we don't necessarily keep track, or I don't necessarily keep track of what the school board does until it comes to a bond issue, and that comes to the assembly. I think that the public should be as involved as possible, so I would like it to go back to, this has been discussed by the assembly many, many times. Bob Bell was very involved when he was on the assembly. I mean, I believe it was Larry Baker that was really involved. He was on the assembly 10 years earlier, and, it's gone back and forth. And I would rather see it go back the other way, where the assembly had more control than less control. So, just so that more of the public would be aware.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Steele?
Yeah, my concern is time and cost. And if the assembly withheld the delegation, does that mean that the district process can be eliminated and the assembly can do it? And is that a cost transfer, or is there added cost by adding the assembly in, either in time or money?
At this point, I don't think the board would not approve school designs or selection of designers. So the way it took place before 2007, when designs and designer selections were submitted to the assembly, those decisions were submitted to the school board, and when they were approved by the school board, they were then approved or submitted to the assembly. And sometimes the assembly set them for public hearings, and sometimes the assembly dealt with them on the consent agenda. Historically, it looked like they were handled differently by the clerk in different situations. So it was an additive step, and I would imagine it would continue to be. I don't think the school board would not do its own review of the school design, or I know they'd have to approve the designer selection. The assembly's selection of the designer, or approval of the school board's selection, I think would be a more accurate way of describing it, was not a procurement decision. The assembly, at least when they did review the designer selection, they did not review the scoring or the qualifications or the rest of the professional services selection process. They simply ratified or didn't ratify, or had the option not to ratify. They never, there's no record of them not ratifying, but they had the option of conceivably not ratifying the district's choice. And the same was true of design. I mean, there's certainly more opportunity. We always wondered in the procurement code whether a bidder that had been selected by the district as a result of the procurement process, scored, ranked, interviewed, whatever, just like the municipality reviews designers, and then selected, awarded a contract. We always wondered whether they would feel aggrieved if, for whatever reason, the assembly rejected them for a reason, for whatever its reason was, but for one not directly linked to the procurement process. We never had to deal with it, and I'm not suggesting that's why you need to endorse this resolution, but it would be an interesting conversation regarding a public procurement process. So we think you're right. Time is the major issue. Initiating assembly reviews after district reviews does add time, and it affects different projects differently in terms of how much time that would be.
And ultimately, you could be increasing legal exposure should the assembly then refuse to approve of it, and you have to go back to square one again.
That was a hypothetical. Yeah, I'm not. Mr. Wheeler might have comments on whether that would constitute bad faith or something like that with the bid. It never came up. Nobody ever chased the question that hard, hypothetically, as far as I know. So it's a question that's out there, but I'm not suggesting that's why you should approve the resolution.
Mr. Keels, was it, you wanted to say something, was it in regards to what Mr. Steele said, or is it
It was
a
actually
different
just
topic?
in regards to what was just said by Mr. Abbott.
Okay, go ahead, and then Mr. Johnson.
So, obviously, I was kind of involved in it during that period of time, based on my previous job assignment. But really, the way it worked on these assemblies, the point of view was, on the consent agenda was the design team. The assembly normally passed that as a consent. Once in a while, it'd be pulled to ask questions. As it pertained to the concept design, the assembly at the time did request that they see concept designs. And the way that worked was there was easels set up in the outside of the atrium as you go into the assembly chambers. It was also on the consent agenda on the concept design. The assembly had the opportunity to look at the concept. In most cases, the assembly chose to just go ahead and let the consent item pass without question. So that's how it worked, and that's how it was met. And so when Mike says that it was very seldom that it actually came up for any type of a discussion, that was only if an assembly member pulled it for discussion during that consent period of time.
Ms. Johnson?
Bill was bringing up an interesting point, and I would I was just wondering, as it currently sits, if you continued his line of questioning as far as the procurement code, would this, if we have the authority to approve this, and we didn't approve it, whose procurement code would supersede the other, or how would that work as far as?
I think what would happen is that you would give either a thumbs up or thumbs down, state your reasons on the record. They would have to start the process over through their code.
So it would always be their procurement code.
Well,
their.
you could certainly change that to require compliance with your procurement process, but I don't think that's what you're talking about doing here. So it would, if you were talking about somebody retaining the final approval, I think it would be a very direct process, as Mr. McGrath described. But it would all be with respect to their procurement code if they didn't start with it.
So, and just for historical sake, in 2007, one of my first legislation was to get rid of the site selection committee, because it really was, it basically told a developer or any land selection that we're out looking for this piece of land before we looked for it, and it became very cumbersome and very political, and actually defeated the purpose. And so that was why I did that. This, I'm, for the same reason, I think, you know, we're all elected for our specific expertise, whatever. God knows actually why we're elected. But I do feel the school board is elected as school board, and that is their, so this is why I'm bringing this up. It's their responsibility. We can engage. I'm gonna be very actively engaged in the Girdwood School, and, you know, have been, and I've sat down with Mike a number of times, and I will continue to sit down with Mike. So there's ways for us to be involved, and there's ways for the public to be involved. So anyways, that's just my 2 cents.
Ms. Greer Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was staff when Clemenson brought this resolution forward. She was on the Assembly School Site Selection Committee also, and she brought it forward for all the right reasons. And I'm assuming the same is true with what's being brought forward today. My only concern is that, I thought I heard you say, Mr. Abbott, that the school board has not approved this concept yet?
They did not want to presume, they have not officially acted on it. They did not want to sort of suggest to the assembly that this was a requirement. So their preference was to bring it to the assembly, get your sense of things. If you were comfortable with this approach, I have no reason to believe the assembly would not endorse it as well.
You mean the school board?
Excuse me, the board. I
Right,
apologize.
because what I think I'd like to see is the school board endorses first, and then the assembly can, you know, take it from there. I'd rather, because it's kind of like, in my opinion, going a little bit backwards. You know, let the school board deal with this concept first, and then the assembly can, you know, make our move, so to speak. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have 2 minutes left, and I want to like to stay on schedule. So is there anything else from anyone? All right. Thank you, Mr. Abbott, for your time. Appreciate it. We'll start in three minutes.